wood, fabric, and an engine smaller than most cars today. These machines changed warfare forever. Here are the 50 most produced biplanes of WW1, from the rarest to the most built. We start with an aircraft that pilots called the furniture van, not exactly a heroic nickname, but the Junkers J1 earned it honestly. It was big, boxy, and moved through the air about as gracefully as the name suggests. But slow does not mean useless. The J1 had something most aircraft of its time did not have: armor. The pilot, the observer, and the engine all sat inside a shell of corrugated aluminum alloy that could stop bullets fired from the ground. That mattered enormously when your job was flying low over enemy trenches. The J1 was also the first all-metal aircraft to enter mass production anywhere in the world. Wood and fabric were the standard of the era, so building a combat aircraft almost entirely from metal was a genuine engineering leap. Germany produced 227 of them, and they served on the Western Front doing exactly the kind of dangerous low-level work that fabric-covered aircraft simply could not survive. Moving from armor to altitude. The Gotha G.4 was built for a very different kind of mission. It was the bomber that brought the war to London. Before the Gotha appeared over England in the summer of 1917, most British civilians felt the fighting was something happening across the Channel, not above their streets. Formations of G4s changed that. They flew in broad daylight at high altitude and dropped bombs on London and other English cities. The psychological impact was enormous. The British government had to pull fighter squadrons back from France just to deal with the threat. Only 230 were built, which sounds like a small number, but a raid of 20 or so Gothas was enough to cause serious panic. One attack in June 1917 killed 162 people, including 18 children, at a school in Poplar, East London. That single raid changed British air defence policy overnight, from bombing cities to hunting ships. The Sopwith T1 Cuckoo was designed to do something that had never been done before at scale: carry a torpedo, fly it out to a warship, and sink it. The British Royal Navy wanted a way to strike the German fleet without risking their own ships, and the Cuckoo was their answer. It carried a single 45-centimeter torpedo under its belly. The plan was ambitious. The Navy intended to launch a massive coordinated strike against the German fleet using Cuckoos flying off aircraft carriers. But the armistice in November 1918 arrived before that raid ever happened. Of the 232 built, most never dropped a torpedo in combat. The Cuckoo is one of WW1's great what-ifs. A genuinely new kind of weapon that was ready to go and never got the chance. The Cuckoo needed a runway, even if its target was at sea. This next aircraft did not. The Machi M5 was an Italian flying boat that could take off and land directly on water, which made it ideal for patrolling the Adriatic, where Italy and Austria-Hungary were fighting a naval war that most history books barely mention. The M5 was fast enough to chase enemy seaplanes and maneuverable enough to fight them. What makes it unusual even today is the layout. The pilot sat in the open at the front. The engine sat above and behind him, facing backwards and pushing instead of pulling. The whole aircraft sat on a hull like a boat. Approximately 244 were built, and they gave Italy real air superiority over the Adriatic. For much of 1917 and 1918, patrolling coastlines and protecting convoys from a category of threat that simply did not exist before aviation. From the Adriatic to Italy's mountain front, the Caproni CA-3 was a monster by the standards of 1915. 3 engines, 3 crew members, and a bomb load that could flatten a building. Italy was fighting Austria-Hungary across some of the most difficult terrain in Europe, steep mountain passes and narrow valleys that made ground observation nearly impossible. A bomber that could reach targets deep behind Austrian lines was enormously valuable. The CA-3 was also one of the most distinctive-looking aircraft of the entire war. It had two separate fuselage booms connected by a shared wing, with engines mounted in the middle and at the rear. It looked like nothing else in the sky. Approximately 300 were built. The Italian national hero and poet Gabriele D'Annunzio personally flew CA-3 bombing missions, which tells you something about how seriously Italy took this aircraft and about D'Annunzio himself. Another aircraft with an unflattering nickname. The Martinsyde G.100 was called the Elephant, and not because it was elegant. It was large, heavy, and underpowered for the fighter role it was originally designed for. Against the nimble German scouts it was supposed to fight over France, it had little chance. But give an aircraft a big fuel tank and a long range, and someone will find a use for it. The Royal Flying Corps sent the Elephant to Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, where it became a surprisingly useful light bomber against Ottoman positions. The wide open desert demanded different qualities than the skies over France. Range and reliability mattered more than raw speed, and the Elephant had both. Around 300 were built. It is one of WW1's clearest examples of an aircraft that failed at its original job and then quietly succeeded at a completely different one. From the desert back to the fighter war over the Western Front. The Roland D.XIII arrived late and never quite got its moment. By the time it reached operational squadrons in meaningful numbers, the war was nearly over. That is a real shame, because it was a capable machine. The BMW engine gave it strong performance at altitude, and its clean lines looked noticeably more modern than many of its contemporaries. The D.XIII was part of a German push in 1918 to replace the aging Albatros fighters that had been the backbone of German air power for 2 years. About 350 were built, but the rapid collapse of the German war effort meant that most of them saw limited action. It is an aircraft remembered more for what it could have done than for what it actually achieved. The Roland arrived too late. This next aircraft had the opposite problem. It arrived when it was needed and spent 2 years doing exactly what it was built for. The Handley Page 0400 was one of the largest aircraft of WW1. Its wingspan stretched nearly 30 meters, and it was designed from the start to bomb Germany itself, not just the front lines. And it did. 0400S flew night raids deep into German territory, hitting railway junctions, munitions factories, and airfields hundreds of kilometers from the trenches. 2 Rolls-Royce Eagle engines gave it enough power to carry almost a ton of bombs. Around 400 were built across British and American factories. If you ever wanted to understand where the concept of strategic bombing came from, the 0400 is one of the earliest practical answers to that question. After the heavy bombers, something quieter but arguably more important. The Aviatik C1 did not drop bombs or chase fighters. Its job was to look. Reconnaissance was probably the most valuable air mission of WW1. Knowing where the enemy had moved his artillery, where reserves were gathering, where a new trench line was being dug, that information won and lost battles. The Aviatik C1 was one of Germany's primary eyes over the front in the early years of the war. It carried an observer in the front seat equipped with a camera and a machine gun, though the gun was mostly for self-defense rather than attack. 548 were built, and while the design was not revolutionary, its reliability and the sheer number produced made it a cornerstone of German aerial reconnaissance in 1915 and 1916. It was eventually replaced by better aircraft, but only after doing its job well for 2 years. Eyes in the sky were not a German advantage alone. Italy built the SAML S.II for exactly the same reason. The Italian front was geographically unlike any other theatre of the war. high mountain passes, narrow valleys, and terrain that made ground observation extraordinarily difficult. An aircraft that could photograph Austrian positions in the Dolomites was worth its weight in gold. The S.II. was fast enough to outrun many fighters, which was the practical alternative to carrying heavy defensive guns and the extra weight that came with them. SAML stands for Società Anonima Meccanica Lombarda, an Italian engineering company not exactly famous outside aviation history circles. 657 were produced, making it Italy's most important dedicated reconnaissance aircraft of the war's later years. You will not find it in many books, but Italian army commanders reading their morning reconnaissance reports in 1917 and 1918 would have recognized the name immediately. The Italian reconnaissance aircraft worked by staying fast and avoiding trouble. This next one was built to cause it. The Pfalz D.XIII was a German fighter that has spent a century living in the shadow of the more famous Albatros. The two aircraft served side by side on the Western Front in 1917 and 1918, and pilots generally preferred the Albatros. The Pfalz was considered slightly slower and less agile. But that comparison is not quite fair because the Pfalz was structurally tougher. German pilots returning from combat frequently noted that the Pfalz could absorb a lot of punishment and still get them home. In a war where many aircraft shed their wings under stress, that kind of durability was not a small thing. Approximately 750 were built. It never became a legend, but a fighter that reliably brings its pilot back to the airfield is doing something right. Pfalz learned from experience. The D-12 was their answer to the criticism that the D-3A was too slow. It arrived in 1918 looking noticeably cleaner, more modern, and genuinely faster. In evaluation tests held by the German Air Service in June 1918, the D-12 competed directly against the Fokker D.XII, which is widely considered the best German fighter of the war. Pilots who flew both left mixed reviews. Some preferred the Fokker's handling, others liked the Pfalz's sturdiness and forward visibility. The D-12 never quite overtook the Fokker in prestige, but with approximately 800 built, it was not an afterthought either. The interesting footnote is that after the armistice, the Allied powers specifically demanded the surrender of all Fokker D-7s by name in the terms of the armistice agreement. The Pfalz D-12 was not mentioned by name. Make of that what you will. The Fokker and Pfalz were chasing each other at altitude. Down near the ground, a different kind of fighting was happening. The Halberstadt TL-4 was a light two-seat aircraft built for close support, flying just above the front lines and attacking infantry, supply columns, and machine gun nests with bombs and guns. It was part of a new German tactical approach in 1918 called Schlagstaffeln, dedicated ground attack squadrons meant to work in close coordination with advancing troops. The CL-4 was small, quick, and difficult to spot from the ground before it was already on top of you. During the German Spring Offensive of 1918, Halberstadt CL-4s played a significant role in breaking through Allied lines in the opening hours. Ground attack aviation as a concept, close air support as armies still practice it today, owes a real debt to aircraft like this one. Around 900 were produced. The CL-4 did not appear from nowhere. Its predecessor, the CL-2, came first and established the same approach a year earlier. The CL-2 started life as an escort aircraft meant to protect German two-seat reconnaissance planes from Allied fighters. But crews quickly discovered it was also very good at hitting targets on the ground, and Germany began using it in both roles simultaneously. This flexibility was valuable. An aircraft that can escort a reconnaissance flight on the way out and strafe a supply depot on the way back earns its keep twice over. The CL-2 and CL-4 are often grouped together in histories of the war, but they were distinct aircraft with slightly different characteristics. Around 900 CL-2s were built. Together with the CL-4, they represent one of the most coherent and deliberate developments in WW1 aviation. A nation systematically building a new type of air power from scratch. Germany was training its pilots to attack. America was training its pilots to fly. The Thomas Morse S-4C was the United States Army's primary advanced trainer after America entered the war in 1917. American aviation in 1917 was in a genuinely embarrassing state. The country had almost no combat-ready pilots and almost no modern aircraft. The S-4C was the machine that was supposed to fix the first problem. It was a single-seat scout trainer, which meant pilots flew it alone, without an instructor to rescue them from mistakes. That sounds risky, and it was. But it also built pilot confidence and prepared them for the solo reality of combat. Around 950 were produced, and a generation of American pilots who later fought in France first learned to handle an agile aircraft in this one. Many of them called it the Tommy. Some of them loved it. Some of them did not survive it. Training for the future. The Voisin 3 belonged entirely to the past, and it knew it. By almost any measure, it was obsolete within a year of entering service. It was slow, it was underpowered, and it had the aerodynamic profile of a flying bookshelf. But it was there in 1914 when almost nothing else was, and that counted for everything. The Voisin 3 holds a significant place in aviation history as one of the first aircraft to drop bombs on the enemy in a deliberate, organized attack. On the night of the 14th of August 1914, just days into the war, French Voisins raided a German Zeppelin hangar. It was crude by any later standard, but it was the beginning of bomber aviation as a real military concept. Approximately 1,000 were built across French and licensed production. By 1916, it was gone from frontline service, replaced by aircraft that could actually outrun a determined bicycle. But the idea it demonstrated never left. The Voisin dropped the first bombs. The Hanover CL-3A represented how far ground attack aviation had come by 1917. Where the Voisin was slow and vulnerable, the Hanover was compact, well-armed, and designed with the rear gunner specifically in mind. Most two-seat aircraft of the era put the gunner in the back seat facing rearward, which left a large blind spot directly below and behind the tail. The Hanover's designers shortened the fuselage and added an unusual biplane tail arrangement that gave the rear gunner a much better field of fire downward. It sounds like a small detail. In a combat situation where an Allied fighter is diving at you from behind, it was the difference between shooting back and getting shot. Around 1,000 were produced. German crews flying escort and ground attack missions in 1918 rated it highly, which is a more honest endorsement than any manufacturer's brochure. The Hanover was fighting over land. The short type 184 was fighting over water and making history while doing it. On the 12th of August 1915, a short 184 piloted by Flight Commander Charles Edmonds flew over the Dardanelles and torpedoed a Turkish supply ship. It was the first time in history that an aircraft had sunk a ship with a torpedo in actual combat. That single event pointed directly toward an entirely new form of naval warfare that would define the next World War more than this one. The 184 was a seaplane, taking off and landing on water, which made it ideal for operating from coastal bases around the Mediterranean and the North Sea. 1,096 were produced, more than any other British seaplane of the war. The torpedo attack that made it famous was achieved because the target ship was already damaged and moving slowly. The pilot himself said so in his report. Honesty like that is rare. Naval history made. Now back to the unglamorous but essential work of watching the enemy. The LVG C6 was Germany's most capable reconnaissance aircraft of the final year of the war. It was fast, it flew high, and it had the range to go deep into Allied territory and come back with photographs that actually told commanders something useful. LVG stood for Luftverkehrs Gesellschaft, a company that had started out building aircraft for passenger travel before the war. That civilian background perhaps explains why their aircraft tended toward reliability and endurance over raw aggression. Approximately 1,100 were built, and they served on multiple fronts, including the Western Front and the Eastern Front. By 1918, the ability to photograph enemy positions from above 6,000 meters, high enough that most fighters struggled to reach you, was genuinely decisive intelligence. The C-6 did that job well. Germany clearly valued reconnaissance very highly. The Rumpler C-4 took that investment to its logical extreme. It could fly so high that most Allied fighters simply could not catch it. At its operational ceiling, it was beyond the reach of almost everything the French and British sent up after it. Allied pilots found it intensely frustrating. You could see the Rumpler, sometimes even get close, and then watch it drift calmly upward out of range. The only real answer was to develop fighters that could match its altitude, which is exactly what happened. The Rumpler C-4 indirectly pushed Allied aviation to build better high-altitude engines. Around 1,190 were produced. There is something almost absurd about a reconnaissance aircraft being so untouchable that it reshaped the development of enemy fighters, but that is exactly what the C-4 did. The Rumpler frustrated the Allies by flying too high to catch. The Hanriot HD-1 had a different kind of story. France built it, tested it, and then turned it down. The French Air Service decided the SPAD fighters were the better option for their own squadrons and passed on the HD-1. Italy and Belgium, however, looked at the same aircraft and saw exactly what they needed. The HD-1 was light, responsive, and easy to fly, qualities that mattered enormously on the Italian front, where pilots were often younger and less experienced than their counterparts over France. Belgium made it their primary fighter for the rest of the war. Italy flew it in large numbers over the Alps and the Adriatic. One of Italy's greatest aces, Silvio Scaroni, scored most of his 26 victories in an HD-1. Approximately 1,200 were produced across French and Italian factories. The country that built it never used it in combat. That detail never gets old. Italy rejected nothing when it came to the CA-5. This aircraft was a genuine point of national pride, and for good reason. It was fast enough to outrun almost any fighter it encountered, which is a remarkable claim for a reconnaissance aircraft. That speed came from a beautifully clean airframe and an efficient engine, and it gave the SA-5 a range that allowed missions no other aircraft of the era could realistically attempt. In August 1918, the poet and aviator Gabriele D'Annunzio, the same man who flew Caproni bombers earlier in the war, led a formation of SAFO-5 on a round trip of over 1,000 kilometers to drop leaflets over Vienna. Not bombs, leaflets. The psychological message that Italy could reach the Austrian capital whenever it chose landed harder than any bomb would have. Approximately 1,245 were produced. It remains one of the most beautiful aircraft of WW1. And that is not a subjective opinion. Aviation historians repeat it constantly. Italy was dropping leaflets on Vienna. Germany was photographing everything between Paris and the English Channel. The LVG C-5 was a step in a long line of German reconnaissance aircraft, and it sat comfortably in the middle of that development. Not as fast as the Rumpler, not as capable at high altitude, but reliable and available in large numbers, which in a long war counts for as much as performance on paper. Approximately 1,250 were produced. The C-5 served alongside its successor, the C-6, during 1917 and 1918, filling out reconnaissance squadrons across multiple fronts. One LVG-C5 achieved an unusual kind of fame on the 28th of November 1916 when it became the first aircraft to bomb London in daylight, flying over the city entirely alone, dropping 6 small bombs and returning to Germany without being intercepted. The pilot's name was Ernst Brandenburg. British air defences that day failed completely. That lone LVG bombed London from high altitude. The Caudron G.4 worked in the opposite way, low, slow, and in formation. It was a French twin-engine bomber that looked fragile and largely was. 2 small rotary engines, an open framework fuselage, and a top speed that a determined runner might argue about. But it was one of the most widely used bombers of the early war years, not because it was particularly good, but because the French, Belgians, British, Italians, and Russians all flew it, and it was available when better options were not. 1,358 were produced. By 1916, it was already being replaced on the Western Front, but it continued serving in secondary theatres for years afterward. The G4 is the kind of aircraft that shows up in the background of every history of early bombing without ever getting its own chapter. It deserves at least a paragraph, from a slow bomber to one of the finest fighters of the entire war. The Sopwith Snipe was designed to replace the Camel, which we will get to later. And it did everything the Camel did, but better. More power, better handling at altitude, and a rotary engine that did not fight the pilot every time he tried to turn. It arrived late, in the final months of the war, and only a few squadrons had converted to it by November 1918. But in the short time it had, one pilot made sure history remembered it. On the 27th of October 1918, Major William Barker attacked a formation of German aircraft while flying a Snipe alone. Outnumbered and wounded multiple times, he continued fighting and was credited with 4 kills before his aircraft was shot down. He survived. He received the Victoria Cross. Barker's fight is often called the greatest single-handed air battle in history. 1,567 Snipes were built, and most of them never fired a shot in anger. Major Barker's extraordinary fight required years of training before the war. The standard J-1 was the aircraft that gave many American pilots their first hours in the air. It was a simple, forgiving 2-seat trainer built in the United States, and the United States Army needed it urgently. When America declared war in April 1917, it had fewer than 200 military aircraft of any kind, almost none of them suitable for combat. The J-1 was the first step in building an air force almost from nothing in the space of 18 months. It was not exciting, it was not fast, and it would have lasted about 30 seconds in combat over France. But pilots who came through it, and then through the Thomas Morse trainer we covered earlier, arrived at the front with enough hours to have a fighting chance. Approximately 1,600 were produced. Most of the young men who flew it were teenagers. Quite a few of them eventually flew something much faster. Those American trainees eventually faced aircraft like this one. The Albatros D.XIII was the final evolution of a fighter family that had dominated the skies over the Western Front throughout 1916 and 1917. The earlier D3 version had been so effective during what German pilots called Bloody April of 1917, a month when the Royal Flying Corps lost 245 aircraft and over 300 men, that the British and French scrambled to build anything that could match it. By the time the D.XIII reached squadrons in significant numbers, newer Allied fighters had caught up. The D.XIII was no longer the best fighter in the sky, and pilots knew it. Its lower wing had a tendency to fail under stress, a serious and sometimes fatal flaw. Germany was already developing replacements, but 1,612 were built, and they served until the end of the war, filling gaps that newer designs had not yet closed. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, flew one briefly before switching to the Fokker triplane. He did not like it. The Albatros had its Bloody April. The Sopwith pup had something rarer, universal affection. Almost every pilot who flew it said the same thing, that it handled beautifully, that it responded to the controls like an extension of your own hands, that it was simply a joy to fly. One Lewis gun, a small engine, and a light airframe that could climb and turn better than aircraft with twice the power. German pilots who tested captured pups were reportedly impressed. It was also the first aircraft to successfully land on a moving ship, a converted cruiser called HMS Furious. In August 1917, that landing, performed by Squadron Commander Edwin Dunning, was the direct ancestor of every carrier landing ever made. 1,770 were produced. The pup was eventually outclassed as the war progressed and faster fighters appeared on both sides. Pilots who had to give theirs up for a more powerful replacement sometimes did so reluctantly. The pup was loved by its pilots. The Albatros D.III was feared by the enemy, which is a different kind of compliment. This is the aircraft that defined Bloody April. Its sesquiplane wing layout, where the lower wing was much narrower than the upper, gave it a distinctive silhouette instantly recognizable in photographs from the period. It was fast, well armed with 2 synchronized machine guns, and handled well enough that experienced pilots could use it very effectively. Von Richthofen scored many of his 80 victories in one. So did Werner Voss, who scored 48 kills before dying in a legendary single combat against 7 British Se-5s. Approximately 1,866 were produced across German and Austrian factories. The lower wing failure problem that later plagued the D-5A was already present in the D-III, but in 1917 it did not matter much because nothing the Allies had could match it anyway. Von Richthofen flew the Albatros D.III. The F.E.2b is the aircraft that killed his mentor. In early 1916, the German Fokker Eindecker had established air superiority over the Western Front using a synchronized gun that fired through the propeller, something British aircraft could not yet do. The F.E.2b was Britain's temporary solution. Instead of figuring out synchronization, they put the engine at the back and the gunner at the front, where he had a clear field of fire with nothing in the way. It was a pusher configuration, ungainly and slower than the Fokker, but it worked. On the 23rd of January 1916, a formation of Fe-2bs shot down Oswald Boelke's wingman. More significantly, it was an Fe-2b crew, Lano Hawker's replacement pilots, that eventually forced down and killed Max Immelmann, the other great German ace of that period. 1,939 were produced. It was obsolete by 1917, but in its moment it stopped the bleeding. The Fe-2b was a stopgap. The DH9A was a rescue operation. Its predecessor, the DH9, had been rushed into service in 1917 with an underpowered engine that let everyone down badly. Crews flying the original DH9 on bombing missions over Germany found they could barely climb above 4,000 meters with a full bomb load, which put them squarely in range of every anti-aircraft gun and fighter the Germans had. Losses were severe. The DH9A fixed this by dropping in an American Liberty engine that nearly doubled the available horsepower. Same airframe, completely different aircraft. With 400 horsepower it could climb, carry a real bomb load, and defend itself at altitude. 1,997 were produced before the armistice, and the type proved so capable that it stayed in Royal Air Force service well into the 1920s. The lesson buried in that story is a simple one. An airframe is only as good as the engine inside it. From a rescued design to one that arguably needed rescuing, the B.E.2c was deliberately designed to be stable. The engineers who built it at the Royal Aircraft Factory wanted an aircraft that would hold steady for reconnaissance photography, that would not wander or buck, that a pilot could trust to fly straight while the observer took pictures. They succeeded completely. The B.E.2c was so stable it was almost incapable of evasive maneuvers. When the Fokker Eindecker appeared in 1915 with its synchronized gun, the B.2c became a death trap. It could not turn fast enough, could not climb fast enough, and the observer sat in the front seat with his field of fire blocked by the wings and struts. German pilots called it easy prey. The RFC had approximately 2,000 built and kept sending them to the front long after everyone knew the problem, simply because there was nothing else ready to replace them. Uncomfortable history, but history nonetheless. Britain was struggling with reconnaissance. Germany had solved it earlier with aircraft like the Albatros C.3. It was a solid, reliable two-seater that served in the reconnaissance role across the eastern and western fronts from 1915 onward. The observer sat in the rear this time with a proper field of fire rearward, which was a meaningful improvement over earlier arrangements. What makes the C.3 particularly interesting is its second life. As newer and more capable reconnaissance types arrived, the C.3 was transferred in large numbers to training schools, where it spent the rest of the war teaching new pilots to fly. An aircraft that is too old for the front, but too useful to retire, ends up shaping the next generation of pilots more than any frontline type ever could. 2,271 were produced, which means it spent the war doing two jobs, fighting and teaching. Both mattered. The Albatros trained German pilots. The Caudron G.3 trained nearly everyone else. France, Britain, Belgium, Italy, Russia, and the United States all flew it at some point, making it one of the most internationally used aircraft of the entire war. It predated the war itself, flying for the first time in 1913, and it was already in service with several air arms when the shooting started in August 1914. Early in the war, it flew actual reconnaissance missions before being replaced by faster designs. Then it settled into training and stayed there for years. 2,450 were produced. The G.3 was not fast, not powerful, and not particularly modern even by 1914 standards. But it was simple enough that a student pilot could learn the basics without the aircraft constantly trying to kill them, which is a quality often underestimated by people who have never had to learn to fly. If the Caudron G.3 trained Europe, the Curtiss JN-4D Jenny trained America. It is probably the most famous trainer ever built, and its fame outlasted the war by decades. The Jenny was the aircraft of barnstormers, the daredevils who toured small-town America after 1918, doing loops and rolls and low passes over cornfields to sell $5 joy rides. Those pilots had learned to fly in it during the war and simply kept going. 2,812 were built during the conflict, and many more afterward. Charles Lindbergh, who flew the Atlantic alone in 1927, learned to fly in a Jenny. The aircraft that pointed the way to modern aviation was taught its first lessons in one of these. A slow, gentle, entirely forgiving machine built for beginners that ended up weaving itself into the fabric of an entire country's relationship with flight. While Jenny was teaching Americans to fly, the Salmson II was sending them into combat. It was the primary reconnaissance aircraft used by American squadrons on the Western Front, and it earned genuine respect from the pilots who flew it. The engine was the interesting part. The Salmson 9Z was a water-cooled radial, a configuration almost nobody else was using at the time, and it was noticeably more reliable than the rotary engines that powered many of its contemporaries. Reliability in 1917 was not a small advantage. An engine failure over enemy territory had very specific consequences. American ace Eddie Rickenbacker, the country's top scorer with 26 kills, began his combat career as an observer in a Salmson before switching to fighters. 3,200 were produced, and the type was still in service with several nations well into the 1920s, which is a quiet way of saying it was exceptionally well made. Germany produced more dedicated reconnaissance aircraft than any other nation in WW1, and the DFW C-5 was one of the most important of them. DFW stood for Deutsche Flugwerk, and the C-5 was their most successful product by a considerable margin. It was pleasant to fly, easy to maintain, and could carry a full camera kit along with defensive armament without complaining about the weight. Approximately 3,250 were produced, making it one of the most common German aircraft of the war's middle years. On the Eastern Front, where the distances were enormous and the front lines shifted constantly, a reliable long-range reconnaissance aircraft was arguably more valuable than a fighter. The DFW C-5 spent most of its career doing exactly that, mapping an enemy that was already beginning to collapse from within and sending back photographs of a front that would simply cease to exist when Russia left the war in 1917. We mentioned earlier that the armistice specifically named the Fokker D.XII by name and demanded its surrender. That distinction tells you something important. The Allied commanders who drafted those terms had spent the last months of the war watching this aircraft make very experienced pilots look ordinary. The D-XII had a remarkable quality that other fighters lacked. It could fly slowly without falling out of the sky. Most aircraft of the era became dangerous at low speed, stalling and spinning with very little warning. The D-XII could hang at the edge of a stall, climb almost vertically, fire a burst and recover. Pilots called it honest, by which they meant it never surprised them. It simply did what they asked. Approximately 3,300 were built before and after the armistice. Some by Fokker in Germany and some under license in Austria. Several ended up in Allied hands after the war. Every pilot who flew one came away impressed. It remains the benchmark against which other WW1 fighters are measured. The Fokker D-XII arrived late and dominated. The Nieuport 17 arrived in 1916 and arguably saved Allied air power at a critical moment. When the Albatros D.III appeared and began inflicting serious losses on British and French squadrons, the Nieuport 17 was one of the very few aircraft that could match it. It was lighter, quicker to turn, and in the hands of a skilled pilot could outmaneuver almost anything it encountered. The great aces of France flew it. George Guynemer scored many of his 54 victories in one. Charles Nungesser flew it. William Bishop, the Canadian ace who was credited with 72 kills, won the Victoria Cross in a solo dawn raid on a German airfield while flying a Nieuport 17. Production numbers are genuinely disputed because Russia licensed and built them in large quantities with records that were never fully preserved. The commonly cited figure is approximately 4,000 across all factories. It was the right aircraft at exactly the right moment. The Nieuport 17 was built almost entirely of wood and fabric. The Breguet 14 pushed deliberately in a different direction. Its designer, Louis Breguet, used aluminum alloy for the internal structure wherever he could, which was unusual and controversial in 1917. The result was an aircraft that was lighter than its rivals for the same structural strength and strong enough to carry a serious bomb load in addition to reconnaissance cameras. The French army used it extensively in both roles simultaneously, which is unusual. Most aircraft of the period were committed to one job or the other. The Breguet 14 could photograph enemy positions in the morning and bomb a rail junction in the afternoon. Approximately 4,000 were produced in France alone, and it served with American, Belgian, and Serbian squadrons as well. It was still flying in small numbers as a mail carrier in South America in the late 1920s. An aircraft does not stay in service for a decade by accident. We are in the top 10 now. The aircraft that opens it is one of the most controversial of the entire war. The R.E.8 was built to replace the B.E.2c, the dangerously stable machine we covered earlier. It was supposed to fix everything the B.E.2c got wrong. In some ways it did. The observer now sat in the rear with a proper field of fire. The engine was more powerful. The structure was modern, but the R.E.8 had a vicious habit of spinning without warning, particularly during takeoff, and early versions killed a number of crews before the problems were partially addressed. Pilots nicknamed it the R.E.8 after a clumsy music hall comedian of the era. Despite its reputation, 4,077 were built, and it became the most widely used British two-seater of the war simply because the RFC needed reconnaissance aircraft in enormous numbers and had very few alternatives. It was never loved. It was used until there was something better. The R.E.8 was unloved but widely used. The DH9 was something worse. It was a disappointment that people had genuinely been excited about. Its predecessor, the DH4, was a fine aircraft, and we will get to it shortly. The DH9 was supposed to be better in every way: longer range, more bomb load, more modern layout. Instead, the BHP engine that powered it turned out to be unreliable and chronically underpowered, delivering far less than the 300 horsepower it promised. Squadrons flying bombing missions over Germany suffered for it. The ceiling was too low, the performance too modest, and crews knew before they took off that they were flying something that could not adequately defend itself at operational altitude. 4,091 were produced before the situation was addressed by the DH9A we already covered, which grafted a proper engine onto the same airframe. The DH9, without that fix, stands as one of WW1 aviation's clearest lessons about what happens when production schedules outrun engineering honesty. After two aircraft defined by their problems, the CSE-5A is a relief. It was straightforwardly excellent. Fast, sturdy, stable enough to aim accurately, and powerful enough to fight at altitude, where many of its rivals began to struggle. Pilots who came from the temperamental rotary engine fighters found the SE-5 a predictable and honest, in a way they deeply appreciated. It was not as maneuverable as the Sopwith Camel, which is coming, but it was considerably easier to fly well, which in combat often matters more than raw agility. Albert Ball, one of Britain's greatest aces, initially hated it and demanded his Nieuport back. Then he flew it in combat and changed his mind. Edward Manock, who ended the war as Britain's top scorer with 61 kills, flew the SE-5A for most of his career and considered it the finest fighter of the war. 5,205 were produced. It is one of those aircraft where the numbers, the pilot testimonials, and the combat record all tell exactly the same story. The SE-5A was a single-seater. The Bristol F.E.2b did the same job with 2 people aboard, and the way it did that job changed how everyone thought about two-seat fighters. When it first appeared at the front in April 1917, the initial tactics were cautious. Pilots flew it like a conventional two-seater, relying on the observer's rear gun for defense. In its very first combat patrol, 4 Bristol fighters were jumped by Richthofen's squadron, and 3 were shot down. A disaster. Then someone realized the Bristol was fast and maneuverable enough to be flown aggressively, like a single-seat fighter, with the observer's gun covering the rear as a bonus rather than the primary weapon. That change in tactics transformed the aircraft completely. With the right approach, it could hold its own against anything. 5,329 were produced, and it remained in RAF service until 1932. 15 years of front-line use is a remarkable endorsement. The Bristol required a change of tactics to unlock its potential. The Sopwith Camel required a change of mindset. It was the most difficult aircraft on this entire list to fly well, and the most deadly to its own pilots if flown carelessly. The rotary engine produced powerful gyroscopic forces that made it turn right with startling speed and turn left with considerable resistance. Pilots who did not understand this died in training accidents before they ever saw the enemy. Those who mastered it had an aircraft of extraordinary agility. In a turning fight, the Camel could go places other aircraft simply could not follow. It was credited with more aerial victories than any other Allied aircraft of the war, over 1,200 confirmed kills. It also killed a significant number of its own pilots in accidents, particularly beginners. Arthur Rhys-Davids, who shot down the great German ace Werner Voss at age 20, flew a Camel. So did the character Snoopy in the Peanuts comic strip, which tells you how deeply the aircraft embedded itself in popular culture. 5,490 were produced. The Camel was agile, but demanded respect. The SPAD S.VII demanded nothing except that you point it at the enemy and push the throttle forward. It was built around a water-cooled inline engine at a time when rotary engines were still common. And that choice gave it a structural rigidity that pilots found enormously reassuring in a dive. You could push the SPAD as fast as it would go and trust that it would not shed its wings. That made it ideal for a particular style of combat, diving fast, firing hard, and extending away before the enemy could react. George Guynemer, the French ace, called it reliable in a way that no rotary engine aircraft ever was. Approximately 5,600 were produced across French, British, Italian, American, Russian, and Belgian factories. It was the first truly modern fighter in the sense that its design philosophy, a powerful engine in a strong airframe built for speed and diving attack, points directly toward fighters that came decades later. The SPAD was elegant in its simplicity. The Sopwith 1.5 strutter was remarkable for a different reason entirely. It was the first British aircraft to enter service with a synchronized machine gun that could fire through the propeller without destroying it. That technology had been available to Germany since 1915, and the months when Germany had it and Britain did not had been brutal for the Royal Flying Corps. The 1.5 strutter closed that gap. It was also genuinely versatile, serving as a single-seat bomber, a two-seat fighter, and a carrier aircraft at various points. The French flew it in larger numbers than the British. It was built in Russia, in France, and in Britain. And 5,939 were produced in total. The nickname came from the distinctive arrangement of the center section struts that gave the upper wing its unusual support, 1.5 pairs, instead of the standard 2. Only aviation people would name an aircraft after its struts. But here we are. The Sopwith was versatile. The Airco DH4 was simply one of the best aircraft of the entire war, and it is not a close argument. When it entered service in 1917, it was faster than most fighters and could outclimb almost anything the Germans sent against it. A bomber that can escape its pursuers by flying faster is a different kind of weapon entirely. Its Rolls-Royce Eagle engine gave it performance that seemed almost unfair compared to what else was in the sky in 1917. German pilots found it genuinely difficult to intercept. There was one serious flaw. The fuel tank sat between the pilot and the observer, which meant a bullet in the wrong place turned the aircraft into a fireball instantly. Crews called it the flying coffin, which tells you they were aware of the problem. The Americans built large numbers under license, and after the war, DH4S became the backbone of the early U.S. airmail service. 6,295 were produced across British and American factories, making it the highest production bomber of the war. The DH4 was the highest production bomber. The Avro 504K was something even more fundamental. It taught more pilots to fly than any other aircraft of the war. The full Avro 504 family across all variants eventually exceeded 11,000 examples, which would make it the most produced aircraft of the entire conflict. But by our rules, we are counting only the most produced single variant, which is the 504K, and its WW1 production alone comes to approximately 8,340. That is still a staggering number. Nearly every British and Commonwealth pilot who flew in WW1 spent time in an Avro 504 at some stage of their training. It was forgiving enough for beginners, responsive enough to teach proper technique, and reliable enough that instructors could focus on teaching rather than managing emergencies. It served in training units from 1913 through the 1930s. A handful were still flying in the 1950s. There is a version of history where the Avro 504 wins this list outright, and it would not be wrong. And here it is. The most produced single variant of any biplane in WW1. The SPAD S.XIII was the direct successor to the S.VII we covered earlier, and it improved on it in nearly every way. More power, 2 guns instead of 1, better climb rate, and a ceiling high enough to fight effectively over the Alps, the English Channel, and the Western Front equally. France produced most of them, but the United States, Italy, Belgium, and several other Allied nations flew it in significant numbers. Eddie Rickenbacker flew one. Francesco Baracca, Italy's top ace, flew one. The American 94th Aero Squadron, the hat-in-the-ring gang, flew them. By the final months of the war, the SPAD S.XIII was everywhere. The Allies needed a fighter to be. 8,472 were built, a number that reflects not just the quality of the aircraft, but the industrial scale that Allied manufacturing had reached by 1917 and 1918, while Germany was struggling with shortages of fuel, rubber, and skilled labor. The SPAD S.XIII did not win the war alone. No aircraft ever does. But it was in the sky above almost every major Allied operation in the war's final year. And when the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, it was the aircraft that defined what Allied air power had become. Wood, fabric, and an engine smaller than most cars today, these machines changed warfare forever. Here are the 50 most produced biplanes of WW1. From the rarest